Hello everyone, and welcome to this month's Living World lecture, hosted by the Department of Ecology and Evolution. I'm Maren Beaupre, and I'm a lecturer in the department. Tonight's speaker hardly requires an introduction, but I shall do my best to try to introduce him properly. Douglas Futuyma is a distinguished professor emeritus and one of the longest serving members of the Department of Ecology and Evolution here at Stony Brook. He's also a research associate at the American Museum of Natural History. He's a world-renowned evolutionary biologist and naturalist whose research focuses on the interactions between insects and their plant hosts. Dr. Futuyma graduated from Cornell University and received both his master's and PhD in zoology from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He has written evolution textbooks that are widely adopted and considered to be the gold standard for undergraduate classrooms. He's also written books for a general audience, including How Birds Evolve, which is what he'll be speaking about today. He also happens to be an avid birder. He has received many honors, including being selected as a Guggenheim Fellow, a Fulbright Fellow, and as a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Sciences. Like so many others, I first heard of him because he wrote the textbook that was used in my first undergraduate evolution course. And I am so honored now to get to be here and teach the very same undergraduate evolution course that he taught here for many, many years. So it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Doug Futuyma.
Thank you, Maren, for the kind words, and thank you all for being here, for coming here. I think the age span of this audience is greater than any audience I've ever faced before, and I feel really gratified by that. Let me start by saying that I think that some of you might have heard a somewhat similar lecture some years ago, maybe 6 or 7 or more years ago. If you did, and if it sounds then familiar in places, the birds are just as beautiful now as they were then, even if I'm not. We'll get underway. Now, as Maureen said, that I developed a course in evolutionary biology, a course in evolution here at Stony Brook, actually never having had such a course in my life because they really didn't exist until they started happening in the early 1970s. And as time went on, I realized I could very well have framed that course entirely using birds as examples, almost from start to finish. And a few years ago, that thought grew to the point where I thought, well, why don't I just write a book that is, in effect, a textbook of evolutionary biology, using all the examples from birds throughout, because birds have actually served to illustrate and to be research subjects on more aspects of evolution than just about any other group of organisms, and with the possible exception of insects. And that starts, of course, with Darwin. Okay, so here's Darwin as a young man. The photo here in the high Andes of Bolivia was taken by me, not by him. But if he'd had a camera, he could have taken photos like this in Chile during that long period in which he was engaged in the voyage on the ship, Her Majesty's ship, the Beagle. And which he then recounted many aspects of that voyage in the book that's come to be called The Voyage of the Beagle. And as a young man, he made numerous observations, which he then drew on many years later when he conceived of not only the existence of evolution, but of its cause, namely natural selection. And in writing The Origin of Species, he basically dwelt on two big questions. What has happened in the history of life? Where did all the diverse living things come from? And how has it happened? How has this process of evolution that he became convinced of, how has that actually happened? So why and how? Okay, and just as and of course at the time, what he was confronting was this radical idea of, he was presenting this radical idea of evolutionary change. He wasn't the only one who postulated that evolution had happened, but in the face of what today's creationists would call intelligent design. The notion that the wonderful features of organisms that equip them for survival and reproduction were the result of the actions of a beneficent creator, an omnipotent, beneficent creator. And so one of the things that he had to do in The Origin of Species was to provide evidence that, in fact, organisms, the species we see today, had evolved by some kind of natural process from antecedents that were very different, that their features had come into existence from ancestors that originally did not have them. And so he gave many sources of evidence for this, including some examples from birds that he had observed in the course of his voyage. And so, for example, he said, "Can a more striking instance of adaptation be given than that of a woodpecker?" Okay. Can a more striking instance of adaptation be given than that of a woodpecker for climbing trees and seizing insects in the chinks of the bark? Yet on the plains of La Plata, in the Pampas of Argentina, where hardly a tree grows, there is a woodpecker, Colaptes campestris, which has 2 toes before and 2 behind, a long pointed tongue, pointed tail feathers sufficiently stiff to support the bird in a vertical position. And he goes on to talk about how this woodpecker is almost identical to a familiar species, what we call the green woodpecker today, in Britain. And he makes the point that here it is, it's living in an environment, without trees. Okay, and he could just as well have been. This is not the woodpecker in the pampas that he was talking about, but he could just as well have been talking about this Andean flicker living at high altitude where not a tree grows. Okay. That's one of the few photos of my own that you'll see today. And then on the next page in The Origin of Species, he says, "What can be plainer than that the webbed feet of ducks and geese are formed for swimming? Yet there are upland geese with webbed feet which rarely go near the water." And he was referring here to this Andean goose and its close relatives in the high Andes, which indeed are almost entirely terrestrial. Okay. And so birds have served as a source of inspiration and evidence on evolution, really from the very beginning, from 1859 on. So Darwin then was concerned not only with demonstrating that evolution has happened, but obviously the question of how has it happened. And here his great original idea, his great insight was the notion of natural selection. Okay. And so he was concerned to explain, for example, how the various features of these various species of hummingbirds, such as their long, narrow bill and their various plumage features, how had those come into existence? Okay. And his answer then was natural selection. And the basic idea of natural selection is extremely simple, as shown in the graph on the left. If you have two types, two kinds of members of a species that differ from one another, and that difference is inherited, then if one of those genetic types has a greater average survival than the other, then it will increase in frequency generation after generation, since it basically survives better and is more likely then to reproduce. It will then increase in number faster than the genetic form which doesn't survive as well. And the same is true if the difference between those two genetic types is not in their survival ability, but in their reproduction, in either the number of offspring females have or the number of offspring that males father. Okay. And that is shown by this graph showing two genetic types, both of which increase, but one increases faster than the other and ultimately will take over the population. And of course, Darwin had no instances of this that he could point to. But since then, there are many, many examples, and some of the best known and best studied examples are in birds. And probably the most famous of them is the work by Peter Grant and Rosemary Grant on a population of finches in the Galapagos Islands, the medium ground finch, in which the bill size has changed over the course of their study from the early 1970s up until, well, actually last year, except this slide was made before last year, showing that over the course of time there have been rather abrupt, rapid changes in the average size of the bill of this species of ground finch. And the result of this results from the fact that the bill of these birds is finely adapted to cracking and harvesting seeds of a particular size and hardness. And what is reflected here is the result first of a drought which caused a deficit of the plant, of the reproduction in the plant that they normally feed on. So instead the birds were turning to larger, harder seeds produced by a different plant, and those birds survived best which had larger bills that were able to process those seeds better. After the drought had passed, the bill size evolved back toward its original level until 2005 or so, when it decreased because those larger seeds were now commandeered by another species of finch, the large-billed ground finch, which had invaded the island from one of the other islands in the archipelago. And the competition from that finch then diminished the supply of the larger seeds, and consequently there was an evolutionary response of the medium ground finch. So this is one of many examples in birds in which evolution has been observed during the course of our life, something that Darwin never imagined we would actually see. Okay? And this carries the implication that often adaptive evolutionary change can be quite rapid. And we can then have some hope that with at least some of the changes in environment that humans are causing can be met by adaptive change in populations of birds and other species. But I'll come back to that at the end because that hope will not always be realized. Okay. Now, natural selection is basically called on to do a lot of work because there are a lot of extraordinary organisms in which you wonder how can we possibly account for some of these features. And among birds, I think one of the most striking is this astonishing hummingbird that I was very eager to see in Ecuador and finally did, the sword-billed hummingbird. And if you know Latin, you will know what its scientific name means: the Encifera encifera, sword bearer. And what could possibly account for that extraordinary bill? Okay. Well, it is analogous to a case that Darwin considered. Darwin was a great orchid fancier, and he wrote a whole book about the flowers of orchids and their modifications for pollination and how those could be explained in evolutionary terms. And that included not only the European species of orchids, but all sorts of tropical orchids that were maintained in greenhouses in London, including one that had been brought there from Madagascar with a nectar tube extending from the corolla that was something like 10 centimeters long. So the nectar is down at the bottom of this tube. And Darwin looked at this plant, and knowing quite a bit about plants and pollination, he said there must exist in Madagascar an unknown moth in the sphinx moth family, the Sphingidae, with a tongue equal to the length of this nectar tube. And something like 25 years later, that moth was indeed found. It is called Xanthopan predicta, the predicted xanthopan moth, with its extraordinarily long proboscis. And the question is, how can we account for the evolution of such an absurdly long nectar tube and such an absurdly long tongue? Why should that be necessary? And Darwin's hypothesis was this, and I've written it and quoted from him up at the top. He says, as the proboscis of the moth was lengthened to obtain nectar, those individual plants which had the longest nectaries would compel the moths to insert their proboscis up to the very base to reach the pollen. And in doing so, their face would then come up against the tongue to reach the nectar. And in doing so, they would insert their face up to the very base, and those plants would be fertilized by pollen being carried on the face. And so the plants with the longest nectar tubes would be forcing the moth to not only to drink their nectar, but to actually pollinate. Okay. But by virtue of this, these plants would yield the most seed, and the seedlings would generally inherit longer nectaries. But then that would exert natural selection on the moth to evolve a longer proboscis, which could be certain to reach the nectar at the end of an even longer nectary than before. And this would go back and forth with the moth and the orchid, both evolving longer and longer characteristics. Well, this has not been studied or tested in this particular orchid. But it has been studied in South Africa using an astonishing species of fly look at the length of that tongue compared to the size of that fly, okay? Feeding on long-tubed plants in the iris family. And these investigators then basically registered to see, is it the case that the longest-tongued flies would be most successful in obtaining nectar, or get the most nectar, and is it true that the longest-tubed plants would be most effectively pollinated? And the answer was yes. Okay, the data are very messy, but nonetheless, there was a statistic that measured that for individual moths and individual plants, and what they found was that the longer the proboscis of the fly, the more nectar on average it would have consumed. Okay, and conversely, the longer the floral tube of the plant, the greater the number of pollen grains the plant received from the fly pollinator. And so it looks as if Darwin's idea is, at least in this case, was supported. The insights that Darwin had are simply, you cannot believe how many insights and ideas he had. You read not only The Origin of Species, but his many other books. And, and he himself said that he had become a machine for generating hypotheses. And he just never stopped thinking. Well, let's go on. So in modern evolutionary biology, a lot of attention has been paid to what's called polymorphism, the existence of two or more genetic types within a single population of a species. And this has been interesting, first of all, because we'd like to know, well, why hasn't one type simply replaced the other? Why do you have two or more types coexisting? And secondly, because it provides an opportunity to actually study the factors that influence the degree to which different genetic types within a species are subject to natural selection or other factors that can affect the course of evolution. And so these cases of polymorphism, of having two or more forms in the same species, in the same population, have been one of the major topics in modern evolutionary biology. And here's one example, a bird that I was very happy to see in Ghana, the black-bellied seed cracker, which I knew of already because I'd read the study by Thomas Smith at UCLA, who had studied a population of these finches and found that you see that there's a polymorphism, some relatively small-billed and large-billed birds. And what he found was that indeed the number of individuals surviving from fledgling to adulthood, as a function of the size of their bill, basically followed more or less this red curve, that there's higher survivorship of those that were quite small and of those that were quite large, but not in between. And it indeed, it won't surprise you that it turned out that the small-billed birds are feeding on seeds that are small, and the large-billed birds feeding on seeds that are large of different plant species. So this is an instance of what you will call, we will find if you read my textbook, is called multiple niche polymorphism. Okay. Here's another example. This is one of the most wonderful examples in all birds. This is a European cuckoo. Okay. This is the one that sounds like a cuckoo clock, or vice versa. Okay. And this particular individual was photographed not in Europe, where it should have been, but in Rhode Island. It was how it had gotten to Rhode Island is anyone's guess, but almost every birder on Long Island, including myself, went up there to see it. Okay. Now, there are many interesting things about the European cuckoo, but the critical thing is that it is a brood parasite, like our cowbirds. That is to say, the females deposit an egg in the nest of another species of bird. those host birds do not discriminate in nestling of a cuckoo versus their own nestlings, but they do discriminate eggs. If they see an egg that looks different from their normal eggs, they will throw it out of the nest. Okay? And so there is selection on cuckoos to lay eggs that resemble the eggs of their host, so that the eggs will be spared. Okay? And it turns out that there are multiple genetic forms in a single population of cuckoos, in which you can see here are the eggs of 6 species of birds that are parasitized by cuckoos. And for each of those, there is a genetic type of cuckoo, called a gens, or Latin for tribe. There is a mimetic type of cuckoo whose egg pretty well matches the egg of their host, with one exception being right here. This is the egg of a dunnock, or hedge sparrow, which is the one bird that doesn't really seem to notice whether an egg looks like it should be there or not. But the other birds all discriminate, and you have these different genetic types of cuckoos that specialize in laying mimetic eggs. And another example of polymorphism you can see in your own backyard tomorrow. If you have a bird feeder, you almost certainly have white-throated sparrows there, which visit here in the winter from breeding up in basically the mountains north of New York, up in the Adirondacks and Catskills and further north. And the white-throated sparrow is a particularly interesting case, because what you will see is birds with bright white stripes and birds with tan stripes. And this is not a sex difference. Both of those color forms occur both in the males and in the females. And what is very curious, and was noticed by a naturalist and birders quite some number of years ago, is that most mated pairs consist of one white bird and one tan bird. And it can go both ways, a white male with a tan female, or a white female with a tan male, which is very unusual, extremely unusual to find within the same species what could be called disassortative mating, mating with unlike rather than like. Okay? And why does that this turns out to be advantageous, because white males, whether they're male or female, are more aggressive. They defend their territory more actively. The males are more promiscuous. I'll refer later on to the fact that in many, many birds, there's a whole lot of what's called extra-pair copulation, which is basically sex outside of marriage. And both the males and the females are more aggressive, and they provide less care to their young because they're too busy being aggressive to other sparrows. Okay? Whereas the tan birds are less aggressive and they're better parents. And so the optimum combination then is one mate who's very good at defending the territory and keeping out intruders who may have sex in mind as well as competing for food, okay? And the other mate is specializing in being a really good parent. Okay? And it turns out that this has been studied by people in neurobiology, and the white form in turn has a more abundant, a particular protein that binds testosterone in a part of the brain that is associated with aggression. And so there's a gene has been identified, and the particular protein identified, and the brain region identified that underlies that particular behavioral difference. And those of you who are biologists in the audience will then think about, well, these cases are interesting, where you have a behavior and you have a color pattern controlled by different genes. How do those genes keep together in the right combinations instead of being mixed every which way? And those of you who know about chromosomes will not be surprised to learn that this has to do with chromosome inversion that prevents those genes from being exchanged in what's called crossing over. And that's the case in a number of other examples of this kind, of which the white-throated sparrow is one instance. So those are examples of evolutionary phenomena that you can observe within species, and how they are studied by evolutionary biologists today, using birds very often as the case studies. Okay? Now, of course, one of the things that I think certainly any naturalist like myself is interested in, and sort of had probably stimulated them to become a biologist in the first place, is the great diversity of life. Okay, how do we explain diversity? And any you could take any group of organisms, but since we're talking about birds, let's take birds. And in many groups of birds, you can see something that's exemplified here by the wood creepers. This is a tribe of birds in neotropical forests that basically behave more or less like our nuthatches. That is to say, most of them clamber around on tree trunks, picking up insects out of crevices here and there, or from the underside of leaves or whatever. And these differ in size from quite a small one here, the wedge-billed wood creeper, to this gigantic sickle-bill. And obviously, look at the differences in their bills as well. Going from here to a stouter bill here, to a very long straight bill in this large one, and a long curved bill in this one, and they're feeding in different ways, feeding on different parts of the tree. This one, for example, probing deep into crevices or insect holes and burrows. Okay, and this is one of many instances. And how do we explain this? And Darwin's explanation was, he said, well, it would be advantageous for any members of one species that are competing for food with another species. If species individuals in species A are competing for food with species B, then any members of species A that are able to shift to a different food would reduce competition from species B, and they would have then an advantage and might have improved survival or reproduction. I mean, the analog in humans might be that, if you're in a small town and there are more than enough doctors, maybe you should just as well become a pharmacist or whatever, something besides a doctor. There may not be room for you. So was Darwin right? And the answer, of course, is yes, or else I would never have mentioned it. And there are many instances of what is called character displacement in birds. And I'll illustrate that here with this grebe. This is a flightless grebe that occurs only in Lake Titicaca in the Andes. And I actually, this is one of the few photos that I took myself on Lake Titicaca, which is the only place that this particular fish-eating bird occurs. There has been a study of grebes by a Swedish investigator, Fjösö, who studied the bill length in specimens not only of Titicaca grebe, but of the much more widespread white-tufted grebe, which is found all through that part of the Andes. Okay, and here you have a transect going north, north and south from a particular point, going toward the north and toward the south. And here, going toward the south, is Lake Titicaca. And here are the specimens. The vertical axis here is the length of the bill in millimeters. And here, and each dot or circle represents the bill length of one museum specimen. And here are all of the Titicaca grebe specimens. They have quite a long bill, okay? And here are, in black below, are all the specimens of the other grebe species, the white-tufted grebe species, which is more widespread. And here are the specimens distributed from point 0 here, southward, including Lake Titicaca, and further south away from Titicaca. And what you see is that in Lake Titicaca, the bills of this white-tufted grebe are on average smaller than they are either to the north or to the south, where it does not encounter the Titicaca grebe species. So this is an example of what has been called character displacement. There's been an evolutionary change in this one population, evidently favoring individuals that have a different sized beak from the resident competing species. And that's associated with a shift in their diet away from small fish towards, from the larger fish that the Titicaca grebe is feeding on, towards smaller fish and especially crustaceans. So this is an example, which is the basis, Darwin said, of how you can explain then the diversification of related species so that they come to be ecologically different from one another and have different characteristics suiting them to their different individual ecologies. Okay. This has got to be one of the most stunning birds in the world. This is Wilson's bird of paradise, and I didn't take this photo, but I have been lucky enough to see this bird in the flesh in one of the most memorable birding experiences I've had. This is on a small island just off the coast of West Papua in New Guinea, in which we basically awoke at something like 3 a.m. and in the dark trudged up a fairly steep, slippery hill in rainforest for about an hour until we got to a point where the guide said, okay, stop and wait here. We have to go be sure that the blind is in good shape. And they came back about 20 minutes later or so and said, okay, follow us. And on this slope, they had set up essentially a mesh fence with a lot of fern fronds pressed up against it so that we could basically hide behind the fern fronds by lying down on the ground and peeking, trying to find a little hole in the fern frond so that we could see the other side. And when it finally got light, in came the male Wilson's bird of paradise, as it did every morning, basically to then come in and clean up its arena, its display territory, by picking up leaves and carrying them off and throwing them away. And there was one of these birds, like 3 or 4 feet away from me. And it was absolutely stunning. Well, the birds of paradise, here are some more birds of paradise. This is one of the most extraordinary families of birds. I mean, this is a great bird of paradise. This is in the same genus, the blue bird of paradise that hangs upside down while it, squawks and flaps its wings and so on. Here is a dancing parotia. You cannot believe the dance that this thing does. It's just astonishing. It just keeps doing it on and on and on and on. A rifle bird with its brilliant throat exposed against the raised wings. And one of my extraordinary features, the King of Saxony bird of paradise with these 2 plumes that are about 50% longer than its body, which it waves around like 2 great antennae as it bounces up and down, causing the branch on which it's sitting to bounce around. These are the most, if you get a chance to see David Attenborough's film on birds in paradise, do. You'll never forget it. Okay. Anyway, what accounts for these extraordinary characteristics of birds of paradise and many, many other kinds of birds? Like, for example, this widow bird, long-tailed widow bird in the grasslands of eastern Africa. Well, Darwin, of course, had an idea. He had an idea about everything. And his second most famous book is called The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. And that book is actually 2 books in one, because more than half of it is a treatment of what he called sexual selection, which is to say the characteristics of one sex that may evolve as a consequence of either competing with other members of that same sex, let's say males, okay, competing with males for access to females, or being preferred by females if they have certain characteristics. And of course, as it turned out, Darwin was absolutely right, as it was so often. One of the first and major studies showing that he was right was on the long-tailed widow bird, a finch in the grasslands of eastern Africa, with these absurdly long tail feathers. And an investigator, Magda Andersson, basically here he divided them up into 4 groups. And one group, he basically shortened their tail. He clipped off the tail feathers near the base. Okay? And he pasted those ends onto the tail fin of other birds so that they had ridiculously abnormally long tails. Okay? And then he had 2 kinds of controls, those that weren't touched at all, and those that were handled the same way as these other birds, but in which he cut the tail feathers but then pasted them back on. Okay? And the outcome was, after a male, if lucky, will attract several females to his territory. Okay? And as it turned out, the number of females that were, of new females that were attracted per male was far greater for these birds that had tails longer than any natural widow bird has. So there's something about a long tail that is absolutely irresistible to females. Okay? And why should that be? Okay. I mean, we know now that Darwin was absolutely right. There are many, many examples of this in which females show preference for particular male characteristics. And you have to ask, why should this be? What's in it for the female? Why should she be turned on by a long-tailed male? That, well, there are several hypotheses that we don't have time to go into. I'll just mention one, which is probably the most popular right now, and that is the idea that males with particular exaggerated characteristics might be particularly healthy. They might have genes that are particularly good at promoting, that make them vigorous enough to be able to actually develop an outstanding characteristic like a ridiculously long tail. And if that is the case, such males might pass on their genes for good health and vigor to their offspring, and so females who mate with them may end up have offspring that are more likely to survive, possibly being more resistant to parasites or diseases, okay, or in one way or another more vigorous than the offspring of males that aren't as well endowed with long feathers. And it turns out that there are a number of cases in which now have been experimentally studied in birds more than any other group of organisms that suggest that this idea has some validity. And I'll just mention two of them. One is barn swallows, in which both sexes, but especially in the male, you have the outer tail feathers extended into these kind of streamers. And it turns out that at least in Europe, females prefer males that have longer streamers, and those males, as it turns out, let me check, I want to be sure that I don't get this quite wrong because it differs between yes, they have those males have fewer lice and their nests have fewer nest mites, and the result is that they have more surviving offspring. So it seems as if there's something about those males that enable them to resist, not only for themselves, but for the nest. And a similar, not quite the same, but the same general idea is with a bird that many of you know. Well, many of you know barn swallows, of course, but also the common yellowthroat, which breeds commonly on Long Island. And in this case, it turns out that that it's been studied both in Wisconsin and in New York by the same couple. And they found that in Wisconsin especially, females prefer males that have a larger black mask. Okay? And in New York, in both places, but especially in New York, females also prefer males that have a brighter yellow throat. And those features are associated with more members of the gene complex called the MHC, the major histocompatibility complex, which is a complex of several, as I understand it, several repeated genes that are critically important in parts of the immune system. And having a more diverse MHC complex basically provides you with more options for fighting off diseases, or for producing antibodies against diseases. And so it seems as if there may indeed be cases in which it's advantageous to females to mate with particularly brilliant or ornamented males, and that this may be advantageous for their young. How am I doing on time?
You're doing great.
Okay. Now, so I've been talking there for the last few slides about evolutionary processes, especially natural selection, and the particular form of natural selection that Darwin called sexual selection, and how birds have served as objects of study for all of these different aspects of studying evolutionary processes. But they've also been studied in many different ways in terms of evolutionary history. And this, the result is we've learned quite a few interesting things as a result of studying their history. And there are basically two sources of evidence on what the history of evolutionary change has been in particular groups of organisms. The most obvious source of evidence is the fossil record. And in some, or especially for various kinds of bivalves and other marine invertebrates, the fossil record is really rich, and you can really study many, many aspects of evolution. But in many groups of organisms, the fossil record is there, but it's more spotty, and it's not, it's not going to provide as many details. And I'll mention one or two fossils, fairly shortly. But another way for studying some aspects of evolutionary history is to simply use living organisms and study their phylogeny. Okay, so what is a phylogeny? It's basically a family tree, illustrated here by these particular species of warblers, many of which are familiar to many of you in the audience, all in the genus Cetophaga. And basically what this says is here each line represents a lineage, a species lineage persisting through time and perhaps evolving as it does so. And it joins, here at this fork, it has descended from a common ancestor that it had with another lineage, okay, which in this case was the common ancestor of two of these species, the chestnut-sided and the yellow warblers. And so this right here, this represents the divergence of one ancestral species into two, the chestnut-sided and yellow. And back here, this fork shows the divergence between that lineage and the species that came to be the black-throated blue warbler. And so back to the beginning here, this stem right here would be the common ancestral, the species that was the common ancestor of all of these warblers. And I won't go into it, but basically from the amount of DNA sequence difference, you can estimate how many million years ago, give or take some million years, how many million years ago each one of these divergence events took place. I should also point out that these beautiful drawings were by Lucy Betty Nash, who is in the audience, and I don't know if she wants to raise her hand to say hello, but Lucy and her husband Stephen, who also contributed beautiful illustrations to this book, have been members of the Stony Brook faculty teaching here for many years. Okay, so that is a phylogeny, and what can you do with a phylogeny? Well, here's another one. This is a phylogeny on a larger scale, and so here we see that today's living birds have as their closest relative in the fossil record the fossil Archaeopteryx, and go back a little further in time, and you find the common ancestor of all the birds, which are living dinosaurs. Their common ancestor with various Velociraptor and other dinosaurs, and further back in time yet was an Archosaur ancestor that gave rise to the dinosaurs and birds on the one hand, and to today's crocodilians on the other hand. So the closest living relatives of birds are crocodiles and alligators and caimans. So what can we do with a study with a tree like this? Well, what we can do in some cases is to trace where in evolutionary time various kinds of changes in characteristics took place. Okay, well. I thought I'd inserted another slide there, but apparently I didn't. Well, this is this is on a still larger scale. This is half of a DNA-based phylogenetic tree that over here goes to the other half of all the birds. Namely, this arrow leads to another page of phylogeny, which is all the songbirds. Okay, all the passeriformes. But these are all these other, essentially all the families of birds in this study by Rick Prum at Yale and his collaborators. And some other people have also done this kind of, and by and large, their studies, their DNA work pretty well matches what Prum et al. Found. And the critical thing that I want to point out here is the distinction right here, this basal fork between this black lineage here on the left of just a few species and all the others. Okay? And that basic branch, that branch point took place around 70 million years ago, which is to say just around the end of the Cretaceous, very shortly before the great asteroid impact and the great mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous. This branch point gives rise, on the one hand, to this group that are called the Paleognathi, that means ancient or old jaw, compared to all other birds that are called neognaths, or new jaw. And it has to do with the anatomy of the jaws. Okay. Well, what are the paleognaths? I'm going to keep using that word, paleognaths. Well, they are, as we can see here, the ostrich and a few other things, namely here. Here are the paleognaths. So we have, among the paleognaths, the ostrich in Africa. You have two species of rheas in South America. You have cassowaries in New Guinea and Australia, which are closely related to the emu in Australia. You have in New Zealand the moas, which are now extinguished by humans. And the only birds here, which is, among these are all giants. The smallest paleognaths here are in traditional paleognaths are the kiwis, which are kind of smaller than chickens. Again in New Zealand. And you have another extinct group in Madagascar, what do they call them? I'm just blanking. And you have a group in tropical America, the tinamous, which are paleognaths, and they differ from all of these others because tinamous can fly. And like they roost in trees. They don't fly much, but they do roost in trees. And if you get too close to one, they will sometimes fly away instead of running away. Okay. And they're sort of chicken-sized birds for the most part, or quail-sized, the smallest ones. Okay. Well, here is here's a hypothesis of the phylogeny of these paleognaths based on anatomy quite some number of years ago, 2001. By Joel Craycraft, a friend of mine who's the curator of birds at the American Museum of Natural History now. And like everyone else, he had basically this one branch giving rise to the tinamous, which can fly on the one hand, and all of these other paleognaths that can't fly. These are all flightless on the other hand. And then here's the branch leading to all other birds, the neognaths. And so the hypothesis here is that the tinamous diverged, the lineage that gave rise to the tinamous diverged from another lineage which lost the ability to fly. Okay? And that then leads to the question, well, if they couldn't fly, how did they get to South America and Africa and all these southern land masses that are separated from one another? And the answer at the time was, well, they did it when all those land masses basically were one large land mass, the continent of Gondwana, that started drifting apart in basically around the time of the Cretaceous and afterward. Okay. In other words, basically there were common ancestors all walking around on Gondwana, and when that Gondwana split up, some of the descendants of those ancestors became ostriches or rheas or cassowaries or whatever. Okay. Now the problem is that the southern land masses were actually, we now know, were already well separated from one another 90 million years ago. That's about 20 million years before the paleognaths started diversifying. Because remember, they branched off around from the all other birds around 70 million years ago. So we have a problem here, which is it doesn't look as if the flightless birds could have been wandering from one landmass to another. They were already too well separated. But now we have a new source of phylogenetic information, namely DNA sequences. And several independent research groups using DNA have come up with a phylogeny of the paleognaths that is quite different from the one that Craycraft had based on anatomy. And as I said, it's well supported by several independent studies. And in this, you find that the tinamous, instead of being the sister group of all the others, the tinamous are now embedded within the other paleognaths. And the tinamous can fly. Now, the entire apparatus associated with flight is highly complex. Okay? And it's very unlikely that tinamous came from a flightless ancestor and re-evolved all the machinery for flying that we see that is so typical of all other flying birds. So the presumption is that the tinamous have been able to fly basically since their ancestor way back to Archaeopteryx. So here's the tinamous line, And at this point in time, it branches off from its closest relative, which is the moas in New Zealand. But if the tinamous could fly at that time, it means that one descendant of this ancestor, namely the descendant that gave rise to the moas, that it lost its ability to fly, shown here by this blue triangle. Okay, let's trace the tinamou ancestry further back in time. And remember, it can fly, it can fly, it can fly. And go back here in time is a branch point that gives rise to the tinamous and moas on the one hand, and on the other hand, to the kiwis and the emu and the cassowaries and the elephant birds in Madagascar. But that ancestor of the tinamou could fly, and so this branch that gave rise to those birds must have lost the ability to fly at that point. So that means two cases in which flightlessness evolved from a flying ancestor. And continue tracing back, okay, the next branching point is this one, which gives rise on the one, I'm sorry, it is this one here. They're all crowded together, but the next one is this one here, which gives rise to the moas, okay? I'm sorry, to the rheas, and which is another case of independent loss of flight. Okay? And then we go back here to the common ancestor of all of them, and you have a branch point that gives rise to the ostrich versus all the other paleognaths. And again, that ancestor must have been able to fly because it was an ancestor of the flying tinamous, and gave rise then to another flightless bird, namely the ostrich. And so if this is right, there are four independent events, four independent cases in which lineages evolved flightlessness and then presumably evolved larger size, or in the course of that they evolved larger size on these different land masses. But they were able to disperse, before that happened, they were able to disperse, they could fly, they could fly across gaps of water, okay? And so the notion is that there has been dispersal among southern continents by flying ancestors that repeatedly would arrive someplace and give rise to descendants that could no longer fly, and that happened again and again. As it turns out, lineage that originated in the northern hemisphere, because we have fossil paleognaths in North America that seem to be this, what's called the sister group, with the common ancestor of all of the living paleognaths. So this is a totally different explanation to account for the existence of these large flightless birds on all of these different land masses, as a result of having what we think now is a much better estimate of the phylogenetic history. And that phylogenetic history tells us that instead of simply walking from one landmass to another, they probably had ancestors that could fly, and then once having arrived somewhere, they eventually gave rise to flightless descendants. So this is an instance, one of many, many examples in which, even without any reference to fossils, whatever, we can say something about the history of evolution of a characteristic, in this case, flightlessness. And there are many, many cases now of studies in birds, in which various features have been studied from this point of view. Okay. So I'm going to leave that there, but just point out that at the same time, there is information in the fossil record which is absolutely essential and which we can't really know, otherwise. And I'll just give one or two examples of that. And one of them is from 2004, when I received my weekly copy of Science, one of the two weekly general science journals, and I looked through the table of contents, and what I saw just blew my mind. It was a title that said, "Old World Fossil Record of Modern Type Hummingbirds." What? There are more than 300 species of living hummingbirds. All of them are in the Western Hemisphere. Most of them in tropical America, South America, and Central America. Small number, 20, more or less, around 20 in North America. Okay? No hummingbirds in Europe. No hummingbirds in Asia or Africa. But this reported, indeed, a fossil hummingbird in Germany which was clearly a hummingbird. And since then, some more fossil hummingbirds have been found in European deposits as European fossils. So it's clear then that there's been a huge extinction, which we would never have known about if it weren't for the fossil record. Okay? There was this broad distribution for which the living birds give us no clue at all. Okay? And the same is true in many, many other examples. And just to give one other example, there's a family of birds, the turacos. They're birds about, more or less that size, related to cuckoos. And this family occurs only in Africa. They're absolutely stunningly beautiful birds. And they're only in Africa today, but there are fossil turacos apparently in North America. Again, absolutely mind-blowing. So the fossil record then basically tells us that much of the current distribution of organisms, the current distribution of characteristics of organisms, in part stems not only from evolutionary change and evolutionary diversification, but has also been greatly shaped and affected by extinction. And I think we always want to bear that in mind. Those of you who are ecologists who think about explaining diversity and patterns in the present day, bear in mind the past has left important imprints on the present. Okay. So that basically raises the question of extinction. And just because it's always happened in the past doesn't mean that we need to encourage it at the present or the time. So I just kind of want to finish with a few words about extinction and endangerment. Okay. So this is a stunning, extraordinary species, the spoon-billed sandpiper. It's just a little bird. It's about that big. It's the only sandpiper that has a bill that's shaped like that. Look at that. Instead of just being a simple pointed tip that's good for pulling things out of the mud, like little worms or crustaceans, it's got this spatulate bill. I'm not quite sure exactly what it does with it. If you want to see a spoon-billed sandpiper, either find your way somehow or another to remote parts of the Siberian tundra, which is where it nests, or go to Thailand in winter, where, if you were lucky, as I was, you can see a few individuals in some salt ponds there. Why is it endangered? Well, one reason it's endangered, as is the case with quite a number of other shorebirds in Asia, one reason it's endangered is that there's virtually no place along the Asian coast where these birds can stop and feed and refuel themselves to continue their flight further south. Okay? Going from Siberia to Australia or someplace takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of energy, and birds need to refuel, just as they do, of course, going from North America to South America. And most of the Asian coast is now so developed that there are very few places where shorebirds can do that. So that's one reason for their endangerment. And of course, we could go on and on with other examples of endangered species, endangered for many, many reasons. One of those reasons is the cage bird trade. In quite a few species in Southeastern Asia, if you go to Java and look for Java sparrow, you will not find it because it is extinct in Java. The only natural population of Java sparrows that still exists can be found in one place along the coast of Bali, where I have been lucky enough to see them. Otherwise, you would go to the Hawaiian Islands or some other places where cage birds have escaped. Okay, and why is that? Because in Southeast Asia, every bird is potentially one that can be put in a cage and hung up on under the eaves outside your house. The cage bird trade in Southeast Asia is just appalling. You cannot believe the magnitude of it. In Europe, you have the killing and netting, shooting, and consumption of millions and millions of birds every fall as they migrate across the eastern Mediterranean coast. In tropical America, well, throughout the world, parrots and macaws are endangered very largely because of the pet trade. I've been lucky enough to see all three of those parrot species, but they are all seriously rare and seriously endangered and require protection. And of course, one of the other reasons is the one that is certainly, the biggest problem is the loss of habitat. Here we have tropical forest being burned as it is. We know, especially in South America, but many other parts of the world as well. And the result of that is, of course, the creation of habitat, largely agricultural habitat, that is utterly unsuitable for forest birds. In northeastern Brazil in 2008, I was lucky enough to have a guide, a really good guide, Ciro Albano, and we traveled I and one other birder with him for, I think it was about 12 days or so, driving long distances in northeastern Brazil to get from one patch of habitat to another, to see the various endemic species there, which included the Alagoas foliage gleaner, in a little island of forest in a sea of sugarcane that went on for miles and miles. Okay, that was 2008. In 2018, that bird was declared officially extinct. Right. And there are many, many more that will follow in its path if they haven't already. So basically, I think we all know that throughout many parts of the world, many species of birds are in trouble, including birds in North America. And so you may know about this study that came out of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology a few years ago, saying that there has been since 1970 something like a 29 or 30% decline in the total number of birds in North America. Just the sum of all their population sizes. Extraordinary. This horrendous decline, and this is true in every habitat except for wetlands. But is in arid lands, eastern forest, Arctic tundra, boreal forest, and especially in grasslands, the change since 1970 has been negative and very considerable. More than about 50% change, a decline in grassland birds. And it's true in most taxa as well, ranging from sparrows and warblers to finches, to starlings, thrushes. Some exceptions are ducks and geese, and I have to here give credit to waterfowl hunters, because without them we wouldn't have national wildlife refuges that are the major remaining habitat, especially in the Midwest, for waterfowl, as well as many, many other species of birds and other species of organisms as well. So actually, hunters have their uses, so to speak. So ducks and geese have increased, but almost all the taxa, especially of land birds, have declined. So extinction is a very, very major process, as I think we all know here. What can we do about it? Well, from an evolutionary, what does an evolutionary biologist have to say? Can we hope that birds will adapt to these onslaughts? After all, we've seen how the finch in the Galapagos Islands could adapt to changes in vegetation very rapidly, as Peter and Rosemary Grant showed. Might birds be able to adapt by evolutionary change? And my answer to that is mostly no. Mostly no. Because we'd be basically asking birds to do a lot more than just evolve a slight change in the size of their bill. In many cases, it would mean being able to adapt to a different habitat because your forest habitat is gone. And if you look at the phylogeny of most groups of birds, you will see that shifts between one major habitat type and another are relatively rare within the phylogenetic history of most groups of birds. Most forest birds are forest birds, and they don't give rise to grassland living, descendants. Okay, and so the loss of habitat for many, many groups of birds equals doom, essentially, almost certainly. And on top of that, we can again look at the consequences that we see of past changes, for example, in climate and habitat during the cyclical glacial and interglacial episodes that have transpired over the course of the last 2 million years. Most species of plants, of birds, of reptiles, of just about everything else, most species did not adapt to major changes in temperature. Rather, they shifted their geographic range, essentially tracking the thermal environment as it shifted latitudinally further to the south during glacial periods, and shifting back further toward the north during the warmer interglacial periods. Okay. I mean, in the case of plants, paleobotanists use plant species as indices of what the climate was like, because of the presumption and the evidence that most plant species don't simply stay in one place and adapt to major climatic changes that are happening. They basically become extinct where the climate becomes bad for them, and persist, if they persist at all, by having dispersed to places where their environment now exists, where their thermal environment now exists. We know that that is happening now with many bird species. Many studies showing on mountains that the distributional limits, breeding range of many species of birds in mountains is shifting upward, just in the last 30 years or so. And of course, once they get to the top, that's going to be the end of them, because you can't shift up into thin air. So we know that by and large, species tend to remain associated with their ecological niche, wherever that ecological niche is distributed in space. And if they can't get to that space where their ecological niche persists, they're in trouble, really serious trouble, likely extinction. This is probably going to be more serious in the tropics than it is in the temperate zone. To move geographically, to a region that is, say 1 degree centigrade different, you have to travel a lot further in Brazil than if you're in the eastern United States. And the likelihood of populations being able to shift over such long distances is going to be lower than shifting over shorter distances in, say, Atlantic North America. And so I have to say that I'm pretty pessimistic about the future of a lot of bird species, but both as a consequence of climate change and, of course, of their loss of habitat and the creation of human habitat instead. What can we do about it? Well, there are conservation agencies, there are conservation efforts, and they have accomplished quite a lot. There are quite a few species of birds that, at least at the moment, you can point to as having escaped from the brink of extinction because of active conservation measures. I've been lucky enough to see both of these. Lear's macaw in Brazil it is still in trouble because it depends on the fruit of a palm that is, of course, declining, being lost. But at least the species itself is protected by law. And it seems to be you have to climb fairly steep cliffs to get up to a plateau where most of them live. And again, the crested ibis is another wonderful example where captive breeding has basically kept this species alive, and it's been reintroduced into China where it was native, and it's also been introduced in Japan. And it is two of many species of birds that have been, at least at the moment, saved from extinction by active conservation measures. Okay, my friend Ushi Daksakaya, who is in the audience, as many of you know, is chair of our department, and he works actively with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which has classified, basically designated, I think, for every bird species, its status of where it lies on the spectrum from basically being safe to critically threatened, critically endangered. And Rashid tells me that they've now established a green list of species that look as if they've recovered from danger enough so that we can feel a little bit more secure about them than we did not too very long ago. So conservation is possible, but of course that happens only if it is supported, only if there is, if there's support for it. And so all I can say is that we can all do our part. We may not be actively involved in a conservation effort, but those of us who can contribute a bit to some conservation-related or environmental organizations of one kind or another. And if you can't do that, you can teach. You can bring people outdoors and show them the world around them. Most people have no idea of the diversity of plants that they're walking past, the diversity of insects, the diversity of birds. I meet, people see me with binoculars or a telescope all the time and talk with me, and inevitably they will tell me, as someone did this morning out at Shinnecock Inlet, will tell me about the bald eagles they've been seeing, or the red-tailed hawk or the osprey. They see a few big birds, they have no idea of the richness of bird life around them, or just about any other kind of life. I became a biologist because as a kid, partly as a result of my father taking me out to parks in New York City, and to the zoo, I started becoming aware of the diversity of life, not just in zoo cages, but in the city parks where I could see frogs and salamanders and finally birds. Most people, I suspect most people here who are biologists may very well have had a start in some way or another realizing something about the diversity of life and how that appealed to them emotionally. And I think we can all do our part, whether we're university professors or whether we're just out in whether we're parents, just exposing young people to the natural world, because once you know what's there, you can begin to care about it. Thank you very much for your patience and attention. Oh, do I take questions? I do, if there are any. Yeah.
I have the impression that the birds around my house are less nervous about me than they used to be. Do they just know I'm older, or are they actually less?
I think those particular individuals have probably accommodated to your, you come and go and you don't show any evidence of hostility to them, and might be different if you met other individuals of those same species elsewhere. Not.
It seems different.
It could be.
Years ago.
That might be. I can't say that I have personal experience like that, but it could be. But we certainly know that some birds, most famously crows and jays, which we know are really, if you can use the word intelligence for anything except humans, crows and jays have it. And we know that they learn individual people. And if you're a researcher and you want to study crows, you have to wear a mask or something so that if you're just walking around like your normal self, they don't scream at you and recognize you as a threat.
So you mentioned that the hosts, the cuckoos, they focus on the eggs but not the fledglings or the nestlings. So why would that be? Why would there be no problem?
I think this, I do not know anyone who has a really good explanation for that. The question is, why don't the hosts of cuckoos discriminate against the nestlings, but instead of just feeding them? I think I think the major hypothesis, and I do not know if there's been any test of this, major hypothesis is that if they were to throw out an unfamiliar or improper looking nestling, they might be throwing out one of their own offspring by mistake. Now, we do know that at least some degree of discrimination can occur, at least in African finches that are parasitized by a group of birds called widow birds. Well, related to that long-tailed widow bird that I showed you, which that one is not a parasite, but there's a related genus that is. And in these parasitic birds, the gape, the mouth lining of the offspring, has brilliantly colored spots, which mimic the spots of the nestlings of the host species, but these being very host-specific individual species of widow birds. So it looks as if in that case there is some potential discrimination against offspring that are not the natural offspring of those parents. But supposedly in things like the hosts of our cowbirds and of these cuckoos, you see these pictures of, well, we wouldn't have any cuckoos or cowbirds if the host parents, did discriminate against them. They just don't.
First instinct would be to think, well, they just aren't smart enough to tell one from the other, but that's practically not true, because these birds, to survive, they need to be able to distinguish between what's food, what's not, what's a predator, what is it. So I think obviously they would have the cognitive, you know, whatever, the machinery to recognize. The fact that they don't, to me, tells that actually they're under selection not to distinguish. There's probably some adaptive value to feed whatever is hungry in your nest.
I think that's maybe another way of phrasing what I think I was trying to say was my understanding of the ongoing thinking on it, but I don't know of any test or way of testing that I do. Yes?
So I have a question about paleognathes. I heard recently that there was a paleognath from like the late Cretaceous that like it rivals the
paleo what?
paleognath.
Yeah.
It rivals like the ostrich side. It's a massive paleognathe. And so that begs the question like what biological adaptation or feature of paleognathes makes them so prone to becoming flightless? Like what is the driving factor for that as opposed to like doves or parrots?
So the question, if you didn't hear it, is what is it about paleognathes that inclines them to become flightless and usually big? Well, of course, becoming big necessarily, I think, means flightlessness. I mean, it's hard to imagine an ostrich actually being able to fly. It would be an awful lot of weight. It would require an awful lot of muscle and an awful lot of wing surface to get it off the ground. But that that wouldn't explain things like kiwis that are certainly small enough to fly, and some of the moas were quite small. So I think you have to ask whether it is the case, and I do not know the answer to this at all. Was the common ancestor of all of today's living paleognaths a giant? Because if it was a giant, like a cassowary or ostrich, then you could see why it would have lost in flightlessness. But now we back up, because what you were just saying is really stupid. That's really wrong, because I just showed you that there's been independent loss of flightlessness, but almost always associated with giant size. So the question is, do we know of any small paleognaths, fossil paleognaths, that were flightless or were flighted? And I'm not aware of any. I'm not aware of any fossil paleognaths that would answer that.
I just think it's weird.
So the one case that would have to be figured out is the kiwis, because those are certainly small enough but they'd be able to, if they had the equipment, they'd be able to fly.
So in relation to the paleognaths, it's very impressive and depressive to see how little evolution cares about parsimony and easy solutions to phylogenies. So I don't know if you have some comments about that in general, and also thinking about like the reason why genes that show like coloration or some random trait has something to do with survival. Like how are they always linked to like specific like traits? Are they bonus, or can they be like byproducts of other mechanisms?
So you asked two questions. Well, one is what's the prevalence of sort of parallel and convergent evolution of phenotypic traits, and that and I mean there's enormous literature on this, right? Because until DNA sequencing became the norm, essentially all of paleontology was, all of phylogeny was based on morphological and other phenotypic traits, and so we know that there are many characteristics, like size is the most obvious one, which again, which evolved this way and that, again and again and again. Okay. There are certainly other cases that are unique, like feathers. Feathers have evolved once in the history of life, and the same, you could say the same is true of, the vertebrate skeleton. Goes on and on. Many examples of especially complex phenotypic traits that are, have evolved once or very, very seldom. I mean, now there are counterexamples like the eye, which is almost the same in cephalopods and in vertebrates, but with important differences. second question, I wasn't sure quite that I quite got it.
Yeah, so it's like all these signals, gene mechanisms, or that link basically maybe coloration or size with something like the major histocompatibility complex. Like there are so different, pathways, or the fact that they are correlated in the genome just to signal this, honest, trait is such a rare thing, I think. I don't know if that's like all birds that are showing these traits are like indicating something.
Well, so I guess I'm not totally sure of the thrust of your question. I mean, certainly there are many cases in which you have the same gene again and again showing a mutational alteration, if not exactly the same mutation, at least the same phenotypic effect. Again and again, there's certainly no question about that. But there are also plenty of cases, and I don't ask me to give you lots of examples off the top of my head, but there are certainly many cases, if not in birds, then in plants and insects, in which you have different genes that underlie the same or very similar phenotypic trait change. And certainly that's going to be especially likely if a particular phenotypic trait is highly polygenic, in which there are many different gene combinations that could give you essentially the same size or length of the feature, or whatever that particular trait is. Right? In fact,
this is, I think, kind of related to what Alex was saying, but like for the white-throated sparrows, for example, are the different color morphs that correspond to these different behaviors? So are these color morphs, is it hypothesized that they're actually involved in like recognition, as like when we see these different colors in birds, is it like a form of recognition that allows like individuals to decide how to mate, or does it just happen to be sort of like a chance genetic event?
I think it's almost certainly the case that, as you said, that the color polymorphism is under selection in and of itself, serving as an indicator of what the likely behavior of this bird is going to be, whether it's going to be more parental or more aggressive, for example. I think that's almost certainly the case. And the fact that you have, as I said, this chromosome inversion that ties together the color locus and the locus that affects the behavior itself, and the hormonal response. I think it's clear that inversion that has been selected and is being maintained in the population exactly for that reason. And you have the same thing that happens in the ruff. So many of you know what a ruff is. It's a sandpiper. It's a European sandpiper. Occasionally we'll get one vagrant on Long Island. And it's a spectacular bird. It's in which the male has this, in breeding plumage, has this long ruff of long-colored feathers on it over its breast, and plumes on its head that match. And the color, and this ruff of long feathers is used by males in display. It can be black, it can be brown, it can be white, or any combination of those. They're sort of highly variable one from another. And these are birds that are polygamous. The males gather together in a group called a lek, in an area called a lek, where they display one another aggressively. And basically, the winner is the one who wins the central area in this arena, with the losers being more peripheral. And females tend to prefer the central male. Okay, so the center is that is the place to fight for, if you can. And in some case, to some extent, the behavior of the bird is signaled by the color of its ruff. So in particular, there is a white form, which is of the male, a white form, which is not aggressive. Instead, it basically tags along with the central male and acts very submissively whenever the central male, dominant male, tries to attack it. It acts submissively, so it's tolerated by the central male. And that turns out, as it turns out, to be advantageous for the second male, for the central male, because females are attracted to this white beetle. And so it helps bring in females. And the white morph basically gets some copulation sort of on the side, even when the female comes in to mate with the central male. And that results in a whole phenomenon that's the study of a whole lot of research called sperm competition, because then you may have a female who is inseminated by 2 or more different males. And the question then becomes, who ends up being the father of that female's offspring? And so there's a whole study, and this happens in insects and birds and all kinds of other things, that is a whole interesting phenomenon in itself that we don't have time to talk about. Yes?
Following up what you just said, beavers have this mating in parental system, right, where they are monogamous or pseudo-monogamous. They offer, like, both parents offer parental care to the offspring, and that seems to be like a very complex trait that is widely spread in many birds. Like, are there hypotheses to explain these type of, behaviors that are so, different from what you just described? So I'm asking.
Quite sure I got the question.
Okay, so I'm asking, like, there are other mating systems, right, different from polygamy, and in birds, monogamy and serial monogamy are, fairly spread out. My question is, are there hypotheses to explain how these behaviors emerge and how they have been maintained throughout the evolution of different birds?
So the question there basically is, what would be the advantages of monogamy versus polygamy? Is that basically what you're asking?
Yes.
And yes, read my book. Now, it gets to be complicated. It really does. A lot of it has to do with the degree to which females really need the help of a male to successfully raise offspring. If they don't, okay, in other words, if a female can do just as well, raising offspring without having a male attending and helping, then it is basically to the male's advantage to just leave her to her own devices to take care of the kids and go off and see if he can find more females. So, because for any male, there's always a conflict between the degree to which it is the degree to which fitness is increased by helping to rear the offspring that are already probably yours, okay, versus going out and hoping that you'll be able to mate with more females and have more offspring. Okay. Why probably yours? Because I refer to the fact that in many, many birds there's a lot of extra pair copulation. So one of the problems of being a male is taking care of offspring that may or may not all be your kids, right? Because of that female may very well have mated with one or more other males when you weren't looking. So it gets to be really complicated. But there is a well-developed theory showing the conditions under which investment in offspring helping offspring, and investment in versus investment in finding more mates or just doing it yourself pays off for the male and for the female. There's an ESS, an evolutionary stable strategy.
So I don't know their family or genus name, but when you talk about the evolution of flightlessness and the paleonates, how far removed are penguins from all of that?
So how far removed are penguins from the flightless paleonates, the ostrich and cassowary and all of those? And the answer is quite far. Penguins are, I could go back into that huge phylogeny of birds that I put, and you'll find that penguins are basically descended from the lineage that gave rise to albatrosses and petrels and shearwaters. So they have independently evolved flightlessness, as has been the case in quite a number of other birds. Okay? So there are scattered instances of flightlessness evolving in cormorants, for example. You probably know what cormorants are. We have a species that's very, very common around here. And there's a cormorant in the Galapagos Islands that is flightless. There are many species of flightless rails. Flightlessness has evolved in rails repeatedly, especially on islands. There are, what else was I just thinking of? Help me.
Duck.
What was it?
Duck.
Duck, right? Yeah, flightless ducks, right? Yeah, the flightless steamer duck.
Yeah.
There are a whole bunch of others, but mostly in these larger birds. Are there any flightless passerines? I'm not sure there are. There's at least one flightless parrot. So one of the birds that every bird would love to see but never will see is the kakapo, which is a New Zealand parrot that's about that big. It's nocturnal, and it can't fly, and it goes trudging around at night, making booming sounds. And they exist only now on a couple of small islands along the coast of New Zealand, where they're very actively protected. And I think it's just about impossible to get a permit to go see one. Yes.
I have a question about conservation. As you were talking towards the end of your talk, what, the limited amount that we can do, we want to do. So I've heard about the issue of window strikes, particularly in cities and during periods of migration. So I'd be curious to know if you, could speak about that a little bit and tell us if there's any conservation efforts that we perhaps could be involved in.
Oh, that is such a good question. So let's say, so back up. In the U.S., in North America, in Canada, in Europe, or whatever, a big source of mortality for migrating birds is, as you said, window strikes. This is especially bad for night flying birds coming up on cities where there's light that can disorient them and to which they may actually be attracted. But it happens everywhere, and it happens right here on this campus. Okay, so I have picked up any number of dead birds. If you get out in the morning, walk around the social sciences building, or sometimes around the life sciences building, South Campus, those buildings, anywhere, at the height of fall migration especially, you're likely to find some dead birds. Okay? And in fact, a few years ago, there were some students who really were intending to try to do something about this and to get the campus to basically to try to install effectively non-reflective windows. The big problem is windows that reflect what looks like sky, or worse yet, what looks like trees, to the bird, and they go flying right into it. And there was an effort to get the campus to adopt a policy of building new buildings with glass that is non-reflective, and there is such, and it's been used in a number of buildings in New York City. New York City Audubon Society has been very actively involved in trying to get the city to, and other places to institute this. And so it's quite a big issue. If you go online, I think you can find quite a lot about it. The problem here on campus is that students are well-meaning and they're really active, but they're only here for a few years, and so that effort, as far as I know, has not been carried forward from the several students that were engaged with it back around 5 years ago or so. And I don't know what the status is on campus now. Yeah.
I do.
Yeah,
Please tell us. I'm the president of the Audubon Society here at Stony Brook, and there is an ongoing project still about the bird strikes. I can put you in contact with people, or if anyone who's interested in birds should definitely join.
So is there a contact,
About the ongoing bird strike
Yeah.
project? Yes.
What is it?
I can pull it up right now. Would you like to write it down?
Can you, yeah. Meanwhile, if there's another question, we'll come back to that. Any other question?
So migration is so common in Southeast, and so fraught, so stressful, and requires a lot of intelligence. So it must be a really good idea, right? So it's easy to understand why you would migrate out of where it gets cold. Why would you migrate back?
Why migrate back? Well, there happen to be quite a few birds already resident in the tropical forests that you migrate to, and they might have something to say about these visitors taking up permanent residence. I can only assume that that is the answer, and of course, migration. Most of the groups of birds that live in the temperate zone and are migratory have seasonal migration. Most of them are descended from tropical ancestors. And so in the book, I give one example of in the orioles, the genus that includes orioles, which is a New World genus. That is basically a tropical genus. There's lots of species of orioles in the tropics, and repeated evolution of migration in species that have basically colonized the north, the temperate zone. And there's something like 5 or 6 independent evolution of seasonal migration in the orioles. And they basically come back to the tropics for the winter, but they don't breed them. But, so I can only assume that there's an awful lot of resources up here, in the warmer months, an awful lot of insects.
Yeah, so that's what I was thinking. Presumably this idea that in the temperate zone too, spring is a boom of insects, right? So you really want to be here when the insects come out.
That's right.
And you can probably have a whole lot more offspring than you stay in the tropics where there's no.
No, absolutely. And one thing that's probably related to that, is clutch size. So there are many examples in which you have close relatives, closely related species that are, permanent resident in the tropics, and other species that are migratory and breed in the temperate zone, like New York. Okay, and in almost all cases, the temperate zone species have larger clutches. They have more offspring per nest than the tropical species do. I mean, tropical species are well known for having small clutch sizes, like maybe 2 eggs. Example is house wren, that is one that I know very well, because I'm the person who studied this. House wren is found in the tropics, like Costa Rica, where I think the average clutch size is something like 3 eggs, or something like that. House wrens up here in New York, which migrate, not sure how far south, but up here, their clutch size is what, I think on the order of 6 or so, 5 or 6. And that is absolutely typical. So tropical birds generally are, even though we think of the tropics as being sort of this, endlessly proliferating great masses of insects and whatever, the fact is most tropical birds are probably food limited. And they're territorial, they defend territories, and most tropical birds, they have a year-round territory. Often both male and female have a permanent pair bond, and both of them defend the territory, not just the male. And they have smaller clutches, so they're probably food limited. Did you have
I do. Is there a marker up there? I could write on the board.
I think there probably is. In that cardboard box.
I have no idea. You do it. I have no idea what to do. Oh, you mean right on? Oh, that's right. That's a board, isn't it?
There were blackboards.
Once upon a time, there were blackboards and you wrote with white chalk. I realize you may never have seen one, but I just want to tell you, just think of what you're missing. Yes, in the back.
Just a quick question. On the topic of migration, I know that climate change is affecting migration patterns in birds because of just changing temperatures, increasing storms, like differences in insect population and whatnot. I'm just curious on whether, what the effects are on birds that migrate longer distances versus birds that migrate shorter distances. Is there any difference, or is it just like all around?
Okay, that's more of an ecological question than evolutionary, and I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. Those that migrate longer distances have to deal with the fact, well, let's take any species that migrates, that breeds up here in the temperate zone, it might be in Maine or it might be in South Carolina. And suppose that they overwinter in Costa Rica or Venezuela or someplace. Okay. One of the problems they face is that if they're in Venezuela, they don't know what's happening up here in New York. They don't know whether the trees have started to leaf out and whether their insects are starting to hatch and caterpillars are starting to develop. Okay. So they don't know. They have no way of monitoring the advance in the spring season that is happening here. They are more or less, they've been genetically, presumably programmed to migrate at a particular time so that they arrive here in, let's say, the first week of May, or the third week of May, depending on the species. And I can tell you that any birder will tell you after a few years of experience when to expect each species of migrant bird to arrive. And they'll say, oh, this one's a week, this one's about 5 days early, or, this one's it's awfully late for this one to still be here. They all finished about a week ago. So the timing is really important, and that's especially for the spring migrants that have to come up and set up territory and be able and depend on the proliferation of caterpillars to be able to feed their offspring. So that timing is really critically important. And as I said, there's no way for them to know what's happening up here, and that means then that there is going to be differential survival and reproductive success of individuals that migrate north and arrive at their breeding grounds at different times, in the second week of May versus the third or fourth week or whatever. And so if the timing of their spring migration, which is done in response to photoperiod, to the change in day length, where they are living, where they're spending the winter, if that timing is basically changed, if the optimal time for the timing has changed, it means that there's going to be natural selection for an evolutionary change in the response to the photoperiod cue, in terms of getting the signal, this particular photoperiod, this particular day length means that it's time for me to move, time to go north. So that's the big issue that is faced, and I talk about that in the book. There have been a few studies along that line. And there's at least one good study of a species of flycatcher in Europe, the colored flycatcher, which is not related to our flycatchers at all, which has shown that there has indeed been a change in the seasonal reproductive cycle in terms of the timing of migration. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but at least it's at least related. So,
Time for one more?
One more question, I guess.
You talked about the discovery of the European hummingbird fossil being a pretty big deal. How do you know that that's evidence for an extinction event of European hummingbirds, or that they were just outcompeted?
Well, wouldn't that be the same?
Oh, well, when I hear event, I thought like some sort of climactic shit.
Oh, no. If I use that word, then maybe that was misused. No, I only meant to say, once they were hummingbirds in Europe, now there aren't, so they became extinct. They didn't. What didn't happen is the species population doesn't decide they're all going to get up and move and move to Africa and stay there forever. That doesn't happen. If they cease to persist in a particular part of the world, it's basically because they've gone extinct.
Great. Well, thank you. And thank you all for coming. Our next talk will be February 12th for Darwin's birthday. So check your email and the website for more information.
This is your copy? Okay, that's right there. Okay, I have. Okay,